In lesson 24, we began tonight. The 18th chapter of Revelation is actually a continuation of the consecutive order of events following the 17th chapter, or after taking time out for an informational passage in the 17th chapter. This continues on with a consecutive order of the Revelation. And so this lesson deals with the destruction of literal Babylon, and it takes place when the seventh vial is poured out. And this will be the last vial, the last part of the last plague that will ever be poured out on this earth again. And some have erred in thinking that this literal Babylon is the same as Mystery Babylon because of similarities. And let us look into chapter 18, beginning with verse 1. And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. When we look at verse 1, it said, after these things that he's talking about is the parenthetical passage that he was shown here as an informational passage in chapter 17. And so this we've studied several times in this series of lessons, where he speaks about after these things, which means that it is a continuation of the revelation. So after these things, or after the things concerning Mystery Babylon, that he saw another angel coming down from heaven. Now, he said another angel, and this is possibly, if you remember, we studied in chapter 14 about the angel that cried that Babylon is fallen, that great city. And so that part was parenthetical, representing the actual time that it takes place here in the 18th chapter. So we're talking about a literal Babylon, a literal city that God will destroy with his wrath. And so he said, I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Did you know that throughout the Bible that Babylon is mentioned many times? Throughout the Bible, there, I believe it's mentioned in 13 books in the Old Testament, and probably 4 books in the New Testament, that Babylon is mentioned. And Babylon is that great city that he speaks about, was built by Nimrod, and Nimrod was the great grandson of Noah. Noah, whose name was Ham, and Ham had a son named Cush, and Cush had a son named Nimrod. And the Bible speaks of him in Genesis chapter 10, verses 10 and 11, that Nimrod was a mighty hunter. And in studying history, Nimrod was not only a hunter of wild beasts, but he was also a hunter of men. And he would go out and conquer men and bring them under his rule. He also taught men how to build walls or fortresses against the wild beasts, because in that time the wild beasts were beginning to multiply, and many men were being killed by them. And so Nimrod became a great hunter, and he hunted the wild beast, and he also brought men under his subjection and became ruler over them. and taught them how to build the walls. And so he built Babylon, the great city. Of course, we have the account of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, how that he walked out into his palace exactly 12 months after Daniel had interpreted a dream for him and told him that in 12 months that he would be driven from men, that he would eat grass with the beasts of the field, and that his hair would grow and his nails would grow as the bird's claws, his hair would grow as bird's feathers, and until 7 times or until 7 years were passed. And so the Bible tells us that this came to pass 12 months after Daniel interpreted this dream and told him this dream. He walked out into this city, and I always like to picture him as probably taking his wife by the hand and strolling through this city, because he built this city on her behalf, and because she came from the plains of Media, or the country of Media, where there were hills and mountains and shrubs and trees and wild animals, and he brought her to the plains near the Euphrates, and she became homesick or lonesome for the countryside. So he built the great city, the great hanging gardens of Babylon, and the hanging gardens of Babylon are referred to as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They were actually tiers upon tiers of arches, and these arches were built first of all with rush, with sticks or limbs of rush, and then they would put a layer of asphalt on top of these arches, and then they would put a layer of tin to keep this from seeping that would hold the water, and then they would fill these tin or these lead, I believe it was lead they used. They would fill these with earth, and they would cultivate it and grow shrubbery, and from a distance Babylon looked like a hillside, a mountain with all kinds of shrubs. And history tells us that he carved animals out of stone and placed them around the walls, so that when they would look out of the window of the palace, that it would appear to be wild animals out in the woods, in the forest. And he done this to make her feel at home. Now, I have some notes here that some of you may remember that I preached a sermon here 23 years ago, just almost 23 years ago, and I used these notes that I'm holding here. They're pretty shop worn, but I preached a sermon here that's entitled, "What Does a Man's Life Consist Of?" And I used Nebuchadnezzar as an example. Now, the city of Babylon was referred to as in history as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and Isaiah referred to Babylon as a city of gold. And in these notes that I got them out today, and the dimensions of this city were 60 miles around, or it was a cubicle 15 miles square, and the walls were 300 feet high, and they were 80 foot thick. Now, history tells us that the chariots could ride 6 abreast along the top of this outside wall. But there was another wall on the inside of the outside wall that was separated a short distance, but it was a narrow wall. But in those days in the cities, they would throw their refuge and garbage and such as this between the walls. It's hard to imagine this, but the walls of this city were about 80 foot thick, and they were buried 35 feet beneath the surface of the ground, and so this was so the enemy could not tunnel under and come into the city. And so there was the city wall and the outside wall. There was about a quarter mile clearance between them, and the outside of the wall was protected by wide moats. And history tells us that they had men eating fish, probably sharks or piranhas, in these moats, so that men wouldn't try to swim across the moat. And then they had 250 towers on the wall, which were watchtowers for the watchmen to stand on the wall. And there were 100 brass gates. And in further study, I see that the brass gates were on the inside of the city. The river Euphrates divided the city diagonally from one side to the other. And there were high walls that were along the banks of the river. And there were walls and there were fences and there were gates of brass, so that people going down to the river would have to climb over this wall and go through one of these brass gates and walk down to the river. And so Nebuchadnezzar felt like the city was simply impregnable by the enemy, that the enemy could not get into him, and they were not to be overcome. And as I said, it was divided by the river Euphrates, and the hanging gardens for his wife are still in history books, are spoken of as one of the seven wonders. It must have been something beautiful to behold. But the Medes and the Persians actually diverted the river Euphrates, and they dried up the river in one night and walked under the walls of the city. And probably, the history doesn't tell us whether the gates of brass were to be locked at night or not. If they were, then the guards probably forgot it. But they probably had come to a place of complacency, that they felt like that the city could not be broken into anyway. But somehow the Medes and Persians diverted the river and walked under the wall on dry land, and without firing a shot, without any confrontation whatsoever, they overtook the city of Babylon, and Belshazzar was killed upon his bed. And it was so quiet, it was so unannounced, that it was 3 days until some of the people of Babylon actually knew that they had been overcome. And so the history of Babylon is quite interesting, and as we look into this, but here we see that we're talking about the literal Babylon. Since that time, Babylon has been destroyed and rebuilt several times. Babylon is not in existence today. I want to make this quite clear in case there are any questions or someone should bring this up later, that there is no city on the site of Babylon. It has been destroyed, and there have been, I believe, either 5 or 7 cities that have used the ruins of Babylon, the stones and the rubble that have been salvaged from Babylon, and have built other cities. There is a city there named Hilla that is built very near the site of original Babylon. As a matter of fact, it is so close to the original site that it would only have to be extended just a little bit to cover the ruins of Babylon. So when we consider the mystical Babylon or the religious system that we talked about last week, in comparison with today's Babylon, the literal Babylon that we're talking about, there are many similarities, and some are that both commit fornication with kings and nations, and both shed the blood of saints, both have cups of sin, both are referred to as a city, both are made desolate, both are called Babylon the Great, and both are clothed in scarlet and purple and decked with precious stones. Now, the reason for this, as we compared mystical Babylon the last 2 weeks, and we're comparing the literal Babylon tonight, is that we are comparing the religious aspect of this city with the physical aspect of Babylon. And I believe that Babylon will be built again. It is very possible that the city of Babylon will be built at the last time. The Bible speaks about this in many places, and it would be very easy. Towns are are built in just a matter of a short time. In 2 or 3 years, a great city can spring up. There have been cities in the United States that have just risen up and built and become great cities in a matter of 2 or 3 years. Did you know that less than 100 years ago that Chicago was not in existence? There was no Chicago, Illinois. The only thing that was there was a swampland at the mouth of the Chicago River. But now, less than 100 years later, there's a great city, a huge city that spans 25 miles along the shoreline of Lake Michigan. And so in the past 100 years, many great things have happened in the United States. And I would go so far to say that in the last 50 years, that many great things have happened. Many inventions, many discoveries, and just the last 10 years we're seeing more scientific improvements, discoveries, and things that we would have never dreamed of 25, 30, or 50 years ago are taking place. If someone would have told us 50 years ago that men were going to the moon, we probably would have laughed at them and said it will not happen, but we know that it has happened. We have evidences, and so when we talk about this angel came down having great power. The earth was lightened with his glory, and he cried with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen. When we examine the scriptures more closely, we will see that two Babylons are quite different for many reasons. First of all, we saw that Mystery Babylon in Revelation 17 is symbolic, and where literal Babylon of Revelation 16 and mentioned in 17 and here in 18 verses 1 through 24, literal Babylon is not symbolic, but it is a literal city. Where one is a mystery, the other is not mentioned as a mystery. Everything in Revelation 17 it has been explained very clearly, so we don't really have to try to go into that further. But John wondered at Mystery Babylon. He stood in awe and admiration and wondered, but he did not do this concerning literal Babylon. One rides the beast, the other does not. The one angel promises to tell John all about Mystery Babylon, while there are several angels that speak concerning literal Babylon. And one is called the woman, the great whore, and etc., and the other is not mentioned by that name. And names are written on one, the other is not so. Mystery Babylon was something new to John, and John was amazed and wondered with great admiration concerning Mystery Babylon, but John was very familiar with literal Babylon, so he understood this city. And so where one is not mentioned by the prophets, the other, literal Babylon, is mentioned many times throughout the Bible. One makes herself rich by deceiving men. Literal Babylon makes others rich. So this is quite a contrast here, that the Mystery Babylon, or a religious system, make themselves rich by deceiving men and receiving monies and goods from the poor, where the literal Babylon within itself as a great commerce center makes other people rich, as we will study just a little bit further. And so one is destroyed by man. We studied last week that God put it in the hearts of the wicked men to destroy Mystery Babylon. But literal Babylon, God himself pours out his wrath and takes revenge on them, and God himself destroys literal Babylon. God puts it into the hearts of men to destroy one, but God destroys the other. And men could not destroy Mystery Babylon in 1 hour, as is true of literal Babylon. And there are 30 articles of commerce mentioned in literal Babylon in chapter 18, verses 11 through 14. That mentions 30 articles of commerce, and we can stop here for just a moment. First of all, he mentioned gold, silver, pearls, purple, scarlet, odors, wine, oil, wheat, beast, sheep, horses, chariots, slaves, fruits, silk, precious stones, fine linen, thyine wood, vessels of ivory, vessels of wood, vessels of brass, vessels of iron, vessels of marble, cinnamon, ointments, frankincense, dainty things, goodly things, and fine flour. So there are 30 articles of commerce that are being produced in Babylon at this time. And so let us understand then that Mystery Babylon is that great false religion of the world that we studied in lesson 23, and that Babylon of Revelation 18 that we're talking about tonight is actually a literal city named Babylon, which will exist at the time of the tribulation week and will be literally destroyed from the face of the earth, never to be built again by an earthquake, when the angel pours out the seventh vial of Revelation 16. And this city will actually be destroyed by God when he pours out his wrath in anger against the wicked city. So let us look again that Babylon has received a verdict, a judgment against Babylon. And he said, I heard another voice from heaven saying. You notice the first voice he heard and was another angel. And this was a mighty angel that came out of heaven and simply proclaimed that Babylon the Great is fallen. But here he said, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. This to me proves that this is the voice of God calling his people out of Babylon. And so the reason for this, he said, that you may not be partakers of her sins, and that you receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Reward her even as she rewarded you, and double unto her double, according to her works. In the cup which she hath filled, fill to her double. How much she hath glorified herself and lived deliciously, so much torment and sorrow give her. For she saith in her heart, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. Therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. We find in Isaiah chapter 47, concerning this very passage of Scripture concerning Babylon, where that she said that she was set as a lady or as a queen, but God told her that she would be judged and that she would be destroyed. So when we look at this city, this great city, he said he heard another voice saying, come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sins, and you receive not of her plague. So there must be some of God's people still in that great city, because he calls them out. But he said, if you do not come out, then you will receive of the plagues along with her. And so here Babylon is personified as a queen and chief of all cities. And for she saith, God didn't say this, but Babylon herself said, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. In other words, she had become exalted and lifted herself up, and come to the place that she felt like that she could not be destroyed. But there are 4 plagues that are pronounced upon her. In the 8th verse, he said, therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. Now when God pours out his vengeance upon Babylon, the Bible tells us that she will never be built again. That they will never live in her again. For he says, therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death, mourning, famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord who judgeth her. And so it tells us that Babylon, the literal city of Babylon, will exist at the time of the tribulation week and will be literally destroyed from the face of the earth, never to be built again. And it's going to be destroyed by an earthquake when the angel pours out the seventh vial. And so this city will be destroyed by God when he pours out his wrath. So the city of Babylon, as I said, was built by Nimrod shortly after the flood. It was the seat of the great false religious system called the Great Whore of Revelation 17, and it did exist as this for many centuries, and the influence of this great religious system has been felt throughout countless ages. And Babylon has been restored several times from the time of Nimrod to its last desolation, and each time in the same vicinity, but not exactly on the same spot as previous times. There is now a city called Hilla, which is built on the Hilla branch of the Euphrates River, and the city Hilla is just south of the ruins of Babylon, which were built from the ruins. And Hilla is a great agricultural belt, and it's becoming more productive every year through the restoration of the ancient irrigation system that was used in Babylon. And let me elaborate on that for just a moment, that history tells us that water flowed through Babylon as blood flows through the veins of the human body. Babylon was truly a magnificent sight. There were 25 streets 150 feet wide that ran the entire length of the city from the north and the south. And there were 25 streets that ran from the east to the west that were 150 feet wide. And if I remember correctly, I can't remember exactly how many squares, but there were something like 567 squares that this city was divided in by these streets. And so it was a beautiful place, 15 miles square, and I could be wrong about the figures, but it doesn't matter. But there were many streets in the city, and so it was a beautiful city. But they rebuilt the water system that was used in Old Babylon, and underneath the riverbed of Babylon were many tunnels. And in these tunnels there were banquet rooms, and these banquet rooms were built of solid brass. I suppose that was to keep the seepage from the river and the dampness from the ground to come into these rooms. But also at the bottom of the city, down underneath the river, there were rooms where man-made pumps were manned by slaves. And the slaves would work 24 hours a day, and they would walk around and around these pumps until one would fall out and he would be replaced by another slave. And that kept water flowing through the city of Babylon. This is how that the hanging gardens were watered, and why that the city flourished and the shrubs and trees were able to grow out here in the city of Babylon. And so they kept this going night and day, 24 hours a day. And so Hilla used this water system as an irrigation system, and therefore became a great agricultural center, an agricultural belt. and it's becoming more productive, and it has large bazaars and a large market for grain. And so the city of Babylon is built on each side of the Hilla branch of the Euphrates River, and had a population of more than 250,000 people as early as the 1940s, and now 40 years later, I'm sure that it has a population much more than this. And so it is a trading center. It is a vast city. And so the city itself has grown in proportion since then also. And so it is possible that Hilla will be Babylon rebuilt. And, if this is true, they wouldn't actually have to build Babylon again, but they would simply have to change the name of the city. And this could happen. This happens all the time. Cities are named many things. I read history right here in Ouachita County, how that some of the smaller towns around here, when they first started, had different names, but because of circumstances or happenings, they would change the name of the town. It is possible, and I do believe that the religious system that started under Nimrod, which will be idolatry, satanic worship, and everything anti-God. And I will say again that I do not believe that the great whore or the harlot church will be a religious system as we know it today. I don't believe it to be the Catholic Church or any other, or Mohammedanism or any other religious body that proclaims or names Christ, or believes that God is the Father, or God the Holy Ghost, and God the Son, or any of this, because all of these religions would have to completely change their mode of worship, their doctrines and beliefs to do this. But I believe that the wickedness of this world will become so great that Satanism and devil worship and all of these false religions will simply grow, and it's doing it now. I was watching an article, I guess you'd call it an article or something, on television that was showing a black lady in New Orleans that was practicing voodoo. And she runs a voodoo museum. But she practices voodoo, and it's amazing to know. It's hard to really realize how many people are following this cult in the United States. Today, she said, there is 500,000 people practicing the black arts or voodoo. And so this will be part of the religious system of the last day. And so it may be closer than we think. It could be. This could happen this very night. It could happen this week or this month. I believe that we're getting closer to this all the time, when people are going to be gullible and they're looking for something different, and they will be deceived and become a part of the false religion, which is Mystery Babylon, or the religious system. But we're talking about the destruction of literal Babylon. And so Hilla is the city that is built near to the ruins of Babylon. But the Bible tells us that this could not be what the prophet was speaking about, or John was speaking about, when he said it will never be built again, because that when God destroys the city of Babylon, this time he's going to destroy the city with fire. It will be like he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, and he will pour out the fire and smoke, and then there will be an earthquake, and the earth will literally open up, swallow the ruins of the city, and it will never be built again. Today there are pieces of the rubble in many cities in the foreign countries. Many of the cities have bricks, have buildings that are built from the bricks that had the Babylonian stamp on them. And so they've carried the stones, they've carried things away from this city, and have built other cities. But the last Babylon that will be destroyed will never be built again. And so he said, therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death, mourning, famine, and burning. And this is what it said, shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. And this fire, I believe that God will actually rain fire and brimstone on the city of Babylon, and he's going to annihilate Babylon and completely destroy Babylon from the face of the earth, and so that they will never find any of the remains, and it will become desolate, never to be built again. And in the 9th and 10th verses, it said, and the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. This could not be the same as Mystery Babylon, because the kings of the earth hated Mystery Babylon, and they gave their power to the Antichrist and joined with him and destroyed the Mystery Babylon. And so in this place, it tells us that the kings of the earth who have committed fornication with her, lived deliciously with her. In other words, they have used her for commerce, and this will be one of the great trade centers of the world that has access for the ships to come in and out. For the Bible tells us that the ships, the merchants, the mariners will see her, because they will see her. Every shipmaster shall see her. And it tells us that Babylon will be lamented by 3 different types of people. First of all, he said the kings of the earth, or the governments of the earth, because of Babylon's great influence in world powers. And so Babylon will actually have a great influence, if not control, over the governments of the world. And so it says the kings of the earth lament over her, they bewail her, lament for her, when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour thy judgment is come. And the second class of people that will bewail her or mourn the destruction of Babylon will be the merchants of the earth, because Babylon will be very important to world commerce, as shown by the 30 articles of commerce that we mentioned earlier. And therefore they will bewail her, because they will lose their place of business, and will no longer be able to buy or sell. And they will be dealing in all of these articles, such as gold, silver, pearls, purple, scarlet, odors, and all 30 of these that are mentioned here. But in the last day, one of the greatest products that in making money is trafficking in drugs. And the word sorceries that he speaks about here concerning Babylon comes from the original word, which means drugs. And so the sorceries and the drug traffic will be heavy, and just a little shipment, maybe one compartment in a ship, could bring drugs. Even today, they're being smuggled into the East Coast, into Florida, into California, and just one shipment can be worth billions of dollars. It's hard to fathom this. It's hard to realize this, that one shipment of drugs can actually be worth billions of dollars on the black market, and it will be distributed and is being distributed across the United States, in Oklahoma, and in Cordell. Drug traffic is very heavy right here in Cordell, Oklahoma. Today, in October the 30th, 1985, drug traffic is heavy, but nothing compared to the commerce or the drug traffic that the merchants of the earth will be carrying with them. And this is the reason for the third class of people that will lament her destruction, and that is every shipmaster that he speaks about. For he said, the kings of the earth, and in the 11th verse he said, and the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise any more, the merchandise of gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, scarlet, all fine wood, and manner of vessels of ivory, all manner of vessels of most precious wood, and of brass, and iron, and marble, and cinnamon, and odors, ointments, frankincense, and wine, and oil, and fine flour, and wheat, and beast, and sheep, horses, and chariots, slaves, and souls of men. And the fruits of thy soul lusted after are departed from thee, and all things which were dainty and goodly are departed from thee, and thou shalt find them no more. The merchants of these things which were made rich by her shall stand afar off for the fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, and purple and scarlet, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. The merchants will lament, and the third class of people who will lament will be the shipmasters, and the maritime world will regret her destruction because of all their contracts for transporting imports and exports, and it will suddenly be of no value to them when Babylon is destroyed. And it says, for in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught, and every shipmaster, this is the 17th verse, and every shipmaster and all the company and ships and sailors, and as many as trade by sea, stood afar off, and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like unto this great city? And they cast dust on their heads, and cried, weeping and wailing, saying, Alas, alas, that great city wherein we were made rich, and all that had ships in the sea, by reason of her costliness, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. Every time, there's no place in history tells us that Babylon has been made desolate or destroyed in 1 hour. And so this is yet to come. And so all of these that trafficked in merchandise, and I do believe that drug traffic is uncontrollable and will be more so at that day, and will be a great source of income. And so we see then that the kings of the earth who have influence over the governments and the merchants of the earth, because of the importance that Babylon has on world commerce, and the maritime world of the shipmasters will lament and mourn because their contracts for transporting the goods to and from Babylon will be of no use to them. And so it tells us that the ships, they will see the smoke, and it says they cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like unto this city? It is very possible that hundreds and possibly even thousands of ships will be in Babylon's harbor at that time, and the shipmasters who will come in by the way of the Persian Sea to the Persian Gulf, to the mouth of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, where Babylon will be built again. It is possible that those that are on the waters at that time in their ships will gaze upon this city and see the smoke and say, what a city is like unto this great city. And so we see that they mourn the passing of Babylon. Now, I see that time has gotten away tonight, and so we will continue with chapter 18, beginning with verse 21 or verse 20 next week, which will still be the same lesson, lesson number 24. Bring your papers back with you next week, and we will continue studying, and we will go ahead and talk about that God, after the merchants and shipmasters and and the kings of the earth bemourn her and lament her, that the heavenly host, the angels, and the holy prophets and the apostles are told to rejoice because God has taken avenge on her or on the enemies of God's people. And so let's continue there next week.